Dr. Darku taught at McGill University and Concordia University. He teaches and researches in the field of economic development, international economics, and monetary economics. Dr. Darku holds a PhD, Doctor of Philosophy in economics with specialization in economic development and international trade and finance from the University, McGill University. He holds a master's degree in economics policy management from McGill University as well, and MPhil and BA Honors degree in economics from the University of Ghana in Accra. In addition to his 12 years teaching experience here, Dr. Darku has served as a consultant to the World Bank, Washington, D.C. between 1998 and 2002. He has also spent 2 years, 1995 to 1997, working with PricewaterhouseCoopers in Accra, Ghana, as an economist. Dr. Darku has two main lines of research. The first focus is on how international trade leads to growth and distribution of income, especially in developing countries. The second line of research focuses on the relationship between business circles, poverty, and income inequality. Most recently, Alex collaborated in editing of the book, The Policy-Making Process in Ghana, How Politicians and Civil Servants Deal with Public Problems. In addition to numerous articles in international peer-reviewed journals and background papers to policy documents at the World Bank, Dr. Darku is the author of 1. Income Inequalities and Saving in Canada, to be published in a special issue of Canadian Studies in Population on the theme of global population and economy. Sources and measurement, that is 2. Sources and measurement of agricultural productivity in Canada, crops and livestock, joint with Stavrula, Mala, and Kian Tran, submitted to the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics in 2014. Analysis of Saharan African trade, pattern in the presence of regional trades agreement, that's the third one, joint with Adriana Apple, submitted to the African Finance Journal, which is forthcoming. So today, Dr. Alex Darku will be speaking on international development, poverty, and income differentials, a special reference to sub-Saharan Africa. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much for your elaborated introduction. Today's presentation is as simple as he said it. We are going to talk about international development, poverty, and income differentials, a special reference to sub-Saharan Africa. The nature of this presentation is said that it might presume that I'm trying to sell myself as the economic messiah for sub-Saharan Africa. I am not. In actual fact, I will not be doing service to sub-Saharan Africa if I do not do my best as an economist from South Africa to contribute my quota to the discussion of the direction of development within the region. So this is where I would first give a background to this inquisitive research of mine, and then discuss some of the first approach to development that Sub-Saharan Africa used after gaining their independence, and then go to the next set of development program, which is the stabilization policies and the structural adjustment programs. Then proceed to the next one, which is the highly indebted poor country strategies and the poverty reduction strategy papers, also from the international institutions. And then we'll discuss the overall performance of these development strategies. And after that, I would propose sort of a new strategy, the way forward, what I think would be the way that will bring significant distribution in the sub-Saharan Africa region. Because we know that when we are talking about developing world, it's made up of 3 big regions: Latin America, Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. And when you compare economic performance of these 3 regions over the past 5 decades, so the situation in sub-Saharan Africa is the worst. And the question is why? And that's what I address. And then what can we do to create a better development path for sub-Saharan Africa? And then I will simply conclude. Okay. The creation of the international financial institutions, and normally referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank, were really very clear in their objectives. The World Bank was supposed to help nations worldwide to develop. The IMF was supposed to help to maintain the viability of the then financial institution, the financial architecture that had been set up by the agreement in Bretton Woods, right? So both were, to start with, highly involved with development around the world. Then their first task, if you recall it, especially the World Bank, was to help Western Europe to come back on its feet after the Second World War, and which is normally known as the Marshall Plan. And after the success of the Marshall Plan, the focus of the World Bank in terms of international development shifted on developing countries. And at that time, if you remember, most African nations hadn't gotten their independence. So as soon as they get their independence, the focus was on them to assist them to develop. And however, most sub-Saharan African countries, the moment they got their independence, took a path that at the time they thought was the best, and meaning they went into what is known in the literature as self-imposed economic exile, inward-looking policies, simply because they did not trust the West to be development partners. And also, they had some examples to follow, because at the time, they would look at India, Nehru's policies in India, they look at Sukarno's policies in Indonesia, and then Perón's policies in Argentina. Those kind of nationalist approach to development was so much appealing, coming from almost a century of colonization. They don't want to have anything to do with the colonial masters of the colonial world. So that led to what is now known as self-imposed economic exile. And that included A, protecting international trade, B, controlling domestic trade within these nations, C, the state getting so much involved in the economic activities rather than private sector as we know in this part of the world, and then also protection of private property. But given that these nations knew as they were and not so developed as they were, they did not have enough funds to pursue some of the policy, some of the development strategies that they had, simply due to low savings. So there was this reliance on the international financial institutions to sort of finance their development strategies. And due to this reliance, we had various forms of economic development strategies proposed by these international financial institutions to these sub-Saharan African countries. And of recent memory, not even going back to the beginning, is the Stabilization Policies and Structural Adjustment Program. Then later, it became the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. And then that initiative got enhanced, and we'll go deep into these things going forward, into what is known as the Enhanced HIPC and the PRSPs. I will explain what they are. And all these approaches attempt to be a top-down approaches. Most of the development programs, or most of the path to development in Sub-Saharan Africa were mostly decided in Washington, in the international institutions, okay? And as most critics say, imposed on the government of these countries. And then these countries, the government will also impose these policies on the people. So the people do not have voice. What I will be proposing at the end of this presentation would be the reverse of that, meaning the bottom up, the one that will give power, voice, and ability to the people that those development strategies are designed for to participate. Okay. So let's go to the first one. As I said, after gaining their independence, the overriding economic theory at the time was of growth and development relied on a model that is normally known as the Harrod-Domar growth model. And this model, which was developed in the early 40s, 46, the Harrod-Domar, simply assumes that nations have a lot of labor, and the only binding constraint on them is capital. So the only way you can develop would be to get enough capital to develop. Okay, and if the nations do not have that much savings for development funds, then there's the need to fill in the gap. And filling in the gap will come from either the rich nations or the international financial institutions. Hence, the two-gap model. And the two gaps here are the A, filling the savings gap, the financial gap, and B, filling the foreign exchange gap. Because no matter what, you need foreign exchange to buy some of the machines and other things for you to pursue industrialization. So that came, and the overriding development strategy at the time was simply development planning. And planning became the order of the day in all developing world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's very common to hear 5-year development plan, 7-year development plan, 3-year development plan. So it was the order of the day. And these development plans, as I said, always came in the form of having first the aggregate growth model and set a broad strategy for the economy, and then having a multi-sector input, output, and social accounting analysis, which will set internally consistent sectorial targets, and then detailed selection of specific sectorial investment projects through project appraisal techniques to ensure the efficiency in the planning of individual projects within the sectors, and then identifying the financing gap and the foreign exchange gap, the two-gap model, so that these plans would be fruitful. Why? Simply because the new government, they don't trust the market. Market was not perfectly functioning. So because of market failure, there was a need for development planning. Also, development planning became a very nice thing because it is the only way that the nations could mobilize the resources and allocate the resources efficiently, so they thought. And also, if we have a development plan that we are implementing for our own future betterment, it would govern some kind of national support. Hence, the development plan became the order of the day. And then it also became the best way that you can obtain financial support from the international financial institutions and the rich nations. So hence, external financing. In other words, anytime you need any loan from any government, you need to show your plan and show that you have the best plan, and then they will know that the money will be put to good use. So those are the reasons for development planning. But then this continued. You know that the first nation to gain independence in Sub-Saharan Africa is Ghana in 1957. So most of what we are discussing are in the 60s, when most of them got their independence. So this continued up to the 70s, almost a decade after these development plans were not doing well. So then there was a need to shift focus. And at the time, the focus was what is known as the basic needs. The basic needs was these international institutions identifying the basic needs of the nations and lending to support to create economic activities to fulfill those basic needs. And then also the shift came simply because at the time of pursuing all the development planning, the idea was really very simple, that as a nation does well to grow, growth will trigger down to the poor. Okay, as the nation grows, the poor will get out of poverty. That didn't become the result. The result of the poverty was increasing. So then there was a need to tweak the then overriding economic development strategy to to take into consideration some poverty reduction ideas, okay, some poverty reduction strategies. So that was the very first time in the 70s that specific attention to eradicating poverty emerged even within the international financial institutions. Okay, so they neglected it the first decade, the first 10 years. But because of this, there was massive aid to sub-Saharan Africa, and the data I have here, the data you see here is not only limited to sub-Saharan Africa. To the developing world, the massive transfer of funds from the rich nations to the developing world began in the 60s in the tune of about 5 billion annually, increasing to about 45 billion annually in the early 1990s. And there was a lot of funds, a lot of money pushed to these nations. But what was the result? The result wasn't good. Very simple. Planning failed due to very simple. You see, planning came into being because people thought markets would fail, hence government would do better. Then, when government pursued the planning failed because government failed. So simply because of government failure, planning failed. Why? There are deficiencies in the plans themselves. The model used, the Harrod-Domar model that was used, let me tell you a little story. Harrod himself did not believe in his model. And 11 years after, he kept criticizing his own model. And that was at the time that the neoclassical model was emerging, and hence the solo growth model, some of you who are doing economics. And he even threw his support to the solo growth model. But the international financial institutions had become addicted to the financing gap that model spells, okay? Because it simply says that if you want to grow, then growth is equal to savings divided by a concept called ICOR. I'm not going to bore you with that concept. And so once you know the ICOR in the economy, and once you know the growth that you are targeting, then you know the savings that you need to obtain that growth. Well, that was very beautiful. And hence, if the nation doesn't have enough savings, fill in the gap. Very beautiful, very simple. So though Harrod-Domar themselves did not believe in the model, the international financial institutions still believed in it and continued pushing the envelope, using it to finance the developing world. So to begin with, it was completely flawed. And one example is that the model, if you use the model, and looking at all the savings and the financing gap that was going to a country like Zambia, the model predicted that Zambia was going to grow up to a level of having about 20,000 per capita income by 1994. This is in the 60s, predicted to 1994. Instead, what happened? Their GDP per capita was only 600 by that time, and it was very close to where it began from, after a lot of money was pumped into that economy. So stories like this makes you wonder why such catastrophic failure of the policy. But beside that, even after all this failure, the application of this gap model continued with the World Bank until the early 90s. In countries like Uganda, Madagascar, Malawi, Tanzania, Mauritius, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, they still continued using the gap model to lend to them. So into the 90s, this is a model that in the late 50s, the originator didn't believe in. Up to the 90s, this model was still the issue. I joined the World Bank, I don't know if I can say everything here, but I joined the World Bank in 1998, and even at that time, I wasn't a spy, but even at that time, I could see the remnant of this financing gap anytime I visited different departments. And I talked to them, and the idea was still there. Though we had moved far away from that, the idea of filling the gap was still there. Which is not too bad, because it is filling the gap. If you have a child going to school and require 20,000 and has only 10,000, you fill in the gap. You give them the 10,000 that they need. So it's not so much wrong, but in the spirit of the Harrod-Domar model, it was wrong. Because Harrod-Domar themselves, they came out with that model only to explain investment and recession occurring in the United States. It wasn't intended to become a model for financing development in the developing world. It wasn't, but it became, because it was hijacked. People became obsessed with it. Okay. So, because of all these funds going to the developing world, the foundation was laid for what then became known as the debt crisis in the developing world. And the West, where Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, the huge debt was in Latin America, but the region with the most countries in this deep debt crisis was in Sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Simply because these nations were still borrowing and were still having deficits in their balance of payment, which required that they kept borrowing, and this led to the then debt crisis. Then there was the need for a change, and hence the emergence of the market economy. How did that change come about? Watch. First, as a result of the failure in planning and government intervention came the advocacy of market mechanism as a key instrument for promoting greater efficiency and more rapid economic growth in the region. And at that time, the leaders in most of the powerful nations were conservatives. And hence the political ascendancy of conservative government in the United States, and we know who it is, Reagan, Britain, Margaret Thatcher, nice lady, Canada, Moroni, and West Germany, it was Chancellor Kohl. Okay? They believed in the neoclassical counter-revolution, neoclassical model, the one that Harrod-Domar was supporting when it emerged in the mid-60s. But then that never became the overriding economic development model, simply because when these Harrod-Domar models were being applied, there also came what is known as the international development revolution. And these were the thinking of most developing countries, economists, and policymakers who continuously believe that the only way we can develop would be to shut the door to the West and develop internally. So the emergence of the neoclassical model in the 50s never became the overriding growth model or development model, simply because of the outcry within the developing world elites that the best way to do is to shut the door to the West. So this continued for a long time, the self-exile continued for a long time, until the 80s, when this ascendancy led to discussions around the world. For instance, President Ronald Reagan made a very famous reference in his meeting in Cancun, Mexico in the early 80s, of what he called the magic of the market. And you know him, he's very charismatic. The magic of market caught fire around the world. Also, the neoclassicalists, people who believe in the neoclassical model at the time, obtained controlling votes on the boards of the two most important international financial institutions, which is the IMF and the World Bank. There are many, the UN, UNDP, ILO, UNCTAD, that kind of thing. But they were not at the forefront of development around the world. So the two at the forefront of development around the world got these neoclassicalists on their board, and they pushed the agenda of selling market approach to the developing world, because the controlled approach wasn't working. So what happened? And you see, these UNDP, ILO, and UNCTAD, and later World Health Organization, these are international organizations that really sell the voices of the developing country world. If you look at it, WHO, United States is as important as Haiti, or as Togo, or as Bangladesh. They have the same vote. But when you go to the IMF and the World Bank, no. They have the quota system. Your vote is proportional to how much you contribute to those institutions. So they have the controlling vote, and hence can change the policy, the forefront policies that they sell to the rest of the world. So that is why they were able to push this across, and hence their belief in the supply side macroeconomic policies and market economy and privatization and public corporations led to the emergence of the stabilization policies and the structure adjustment policies around the world. What are stabilization policies? Simply a coordinated set of mostly restrictive fiscal and monetary. If you want to understand this very well, listen to the news about what is happening in what's the name of that country in Europe? In Greece. Okay? Because that is where you will really understand this very well. By simply a coordinated set of mostly restrictive fiscal and monetary policies aimed at reducing inflation, reducing budget deficit, and improving the balance of payments. Really very simple. Making sure the nations do well at home, on the home front, and also do well on the foreign front, international front, which is the current account and the balance of payments. So this was the policy, the stabilization policy was the policy from the IMF side of the international financial institutions, and the structural adjustment program was the program from the World Bank front of the international institution. So really, the idea was very laudable at the time. I remember I was in high school thinking of doing economics when I go to the university, and I saw a big front page, Ghana Welcome Stabilization Policy. And I read it. I was waiting for my bus at the bus stop, and I read it, and I was so happy because it made every sense that the little boy can take out of this piece, okay? The story is really very simple. Take it like this. If a train is leaving Vancouver to Montreal and it gets derailed somewhere in Calgary, if the train gets derailed in Calgary, what do? It's very simple. You bring it back to the rail, you stabilize it, and then it goes forward. So the economies were derailed. And the only way to get it forward would be to stabilize the economy before growth, okay? So the sequence was very simple. You go to IMF to stabilize your economy. And stabilization what? High inflation is there, so do something about your inflation. High budget deficit is there, do something about your deficit. High balance of payment deficit, do something about them. So, and this call for these restrictive monetary and fiscal policies, okay? So that is the stabilization. So the economy gets stabilized. You move from 100% inflation to 20 or to 12%. That's fine. You are stabilized. Your government is not spending too much, so deficit is not too much. You are stabilized. And when you are stabilized, you go to the World Bank. Okay, so it's like you go to the emergency, you get stabilized, and then you go to the ward to be treated by the doctor, in-house doctor. Really very laudable. I loved it in '83 when I first read this thing. So you go to the World Bank to get a lot of what is known as adjustment loans, which are the big loans to help you go forward. Okay? So that's the whole idea. And hence this became the instrument of the quest to revive growth in stagnant economies in the developing world, especially sub-Saharan Africa. So I may have even gone deep into this. So the idea is very simple. Liberalize foreign exchange, because these nations didn't only control the economy within, they also controlled trade internationally. They also controlled foreign movement of foreign currency. We call it exchange controls. So liberalization of foreign exchange and import controls, devaluation of official exchange rate, because the official exchange rate were fixed, pegged, and it was so overheated, so overvalued, given the inflation that was happening in those economies. So you need to liberalize it. Let it become market determined, liberalizing the official exchange rate, and eventual adoption of the flexible exchange rate system. Very simple. Also, these nations are supposed, as I said earlier on, to implement anti-inflation policies such as control of bank credit to raise interest rate and reserve requirement, control of government deficit through the reduction of government spending on social services and increase in taxes and public enterprise, increasing in public enterprise prices, control of wage increases, and then reduction in the growth of money. Why? Because as the pure theoretical model says, growth in money leads to inflation, given that it does not normally lead to increase in economic activities in these economies. And then the World Bank will come in to help you to privatize and restructure your economy. And then also reallocation of public spending towards operations and maintenance, health, education, and infrastructure. And then liberalization of the domestic market. Opening up the economy to international trade, greater hospitality to foreign investment. Don't be so suspicious, okay? It's gone. And through this, the nations get support from the IMF, and the support from the IMF is simply known as the Structural Adjustment Facility. It's money. And then later it became the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility. And then the World Bank also gives you loans, which is known as the World Bank Structural Adjustment Lending. So this is what you do. You go to the IMF, you take these facilities, so you adjust your economy. You stabilize your economy. Then you go to the World Bank, take these loans to move the economy forward. Outcomes. Civilization didn't help. Civilization and social adjustment didn't help. It still continues as I speak to you, one way or the other. We'll see that. But it didn't help. Why? Because there were a lot of social costs of those adjustments. And these social costs, once again, will fail the poor. You remember that earlier on, it took a decade before we realized that what we are doing is not good for the poor. Then we did it again. I don't know when we will learn. We did it again. These policies were so getting the prices right became the obsession of the IMF. So they focused on that, not thinking about what will be the implication on the poor in these developing nations. So around the development where I told you 83, I started following this as a kid. And then 4, 5, 6 years down the road, we realized how these policies were hurting the poor. Why? Because most of the government spending adjustment were in the form of withdrawal of subsidies at the time given to the poor. And what are the subsidies to the poor? You subsidize fertilizer input to the poor farmer in the village somewhere. You subsidize health, you subsidize education. Most of all these subsidies were withdrawn. And who are those who felt the brunt the worst? The poor. So the poverty alleviation part of this program also came later. And later, around the developing world, you would hear many acronyms. In Ghana, in my country, we call it PAMSCAD. And what is PAMSCAD? It is Program of Action to Mitigate Against the Social Cost of Adjustment. And a later afterthought. In India, Bangladesh, everywhere around the developing world, there was this afterthought added to the program of the day because they did not perceive that. And then, again, many nations did not adjust. They took the loans and did not adjust. And that is the problem. You see, this presentation I'm giving, some of these ideas come from a senior fellow when I was working at the World Bank called William Easterly. He had given a speech a lot similar to this, and he cast his presentation in the form of wrong incentives. Wrong incentives, and I will chip it in what he meant by that. And also, Jeffrey Sachs has also given a very good piece about why Africa has not done well. Okay, and these two are two of the top critics of the World Bank. One within the World Bank, William Easterly, and one outside the World Bank, which is Jeffrey Sachs. And William Easterly's idea was very simple. He says that the incentive structure of these programs are not good for these developing countries. Why? What's the incentive of the World Bank and the IMF? They have the incentive to do their duty. What's their duty? Lend. Keep lending. And once you have a nation that you are lending to, you tend to be obsessed with that nation because you need to be seen doing the right thing. All right? And what is the incentive of the recipient government? The incentive of the recipient government, corrupt government, was to keep doing what the IMF and the World Bank want them to do so they can get the disbursements, federal disbursements, because the disbursements are based on benchmark. Okay? And sometimes it was criticized that some of these governments were cooking the data. Because if in the next 3 years inflation should be around 20% before you get the next 2 billion, I can bring 20% inflation to you. And I personally even experienced that when I was working at the World Bank, where I will not mention which government, but that government tried to intimidate me to agree on the disbursement of the fund when I was sitting in for the senior economist that I was working at who had taken home leave to Europe. Okay? So the incentive structures didn't work well for the poor. Okay? So they have the incentive to disburse the funds, they have the incentive to get the funds so that some can pass through some way. Corruption, we know that. So, did the nations actually adjust? The answer is no, in most cases. Why? For instance, 10 adjustment loans were given to Zambia over the period 1980 to 1992, yet the country hit all-time high inflation of 166% in 1992, after they had adjusted for more than a decade. So what's the adjustment? There. Second, 15 adjustment loans were given to Kenya over the same period, yet the Kenyan government still had budget deficit over 8% of the GDP in 1992 to 1993. Third, Ghana, my own country, I lived through this, I saw it. Inflation increased from 11% to 32% between 92 and 93, after it decreased from all-time high of 123 in the 1983. It was 1983 that we went for adjustment. And from 123, I think we hit about 40 in 1984, which everybody was so happy. Such a stabilization program is so good. But there are a lot of explanations which I can't go through because of time constraint. But between 92 and 93 was the time that the nation had done so well that it was recommended to move to multi-party system. So the then military government, wanting to become the third republic president, had to spend more to gain vote. And hence, it led inflation from 11% to 32%. It is no magic, it is really very basic economics that happened, okay? So most of the gains were reversed. But as part of the program, you go to the IMF, you stabilize, you go to the World Bank, you adjust. Then if that nation is not a democratic nation, you push them to become democratic. The pushing to democratic always reversed, mostly reversed the gains. Because I would want to continue anyway. What would I do? I would spend more. So everything got respect. Government spending increased, money supply increased, inflation increased, deficit came back, current account balance of payment deficit came back. Everything that we had adjusted reversed. And this is why the IMF and the World Bank, and I will say this on record, dropped Ghana as the poster boy to the rest of the world and picked Uganda. At the time Uganda was emerging, Uganda was very late in adjusting. It was in around 89 or so. Ghana was 83, so 6 years after. And Ghana had been doing so well. And if you look at the publication around the world talking about how good this thing is, Ghana was over-researched. Every paper was on Ghana. And so to the rest of the world. So most African nations followed the program because they saw what is supposed to be the benefit of the program to Ghana. All right? And Uganda was late at the time, but Uganda did a very good job because at the time of adjustment, the leader at the time himself identified himself to be responsible for inflation. I remember this very well. That I am going to be in charge of inflation. And if inflation doesn't go down, I am at fault. And that worked. It went down and stayed there forever. So hence, Ghana was switched for Uganda. Uganda was sold as the best adjustment country in sub-Saharan Africa. Very simple. Privatization. What's privatization? Divest. State-owned enterprises should be sold to private because that is the best way to go. Okay? And hence, but who are those who are doing that? The politicians at the time. Who are they going to sell to? In most cases, to themselves. All right? What is the incentive structure? You recommend a policy, it has its own incentive, it has its result. Very simple, quite basic. All right? Hence, it did not work. It actually increased inefficiency. It increased corruption. Again, privatization. Kenyan Railways faced financial troubles since 1972. So one of the best candidates to privatize in Kenya should have been that. But what happened? Yet it was not privatized, and financial troubles of the railway continued even up to 1996, according to the World Bank report. The World Bank reported it. So was there privatization? Was there effective privatization? No. Was there adjustment? No. In most cases, no. What about overall economic growth? Growth in output per capita in sub-Saharan Africa was 0.7% between 78 and 87, and it was 0.6% between 87 and 95. When other developing countries in Latin America and in Asia were growing at about 5% GDP per capita. But then in Africa, there were some few exceptions. That is Uganda at the time, Botswana and Mauritius, were those who grew somewhere closer to this 5%. But the rest were, so it was really like what is known as the missing group. Where did all the money go to? Then the mandatory spending cuts, these mandatory spending cuts did not happen the way it was intended to. Why? Because of the government incentives to do what they want to do. The best way to do it would be to use the opportunity to see how they can siphon off some of the funds. So this has gone on for a long time and did not bring anything very reasonable or meaningful for the development dream of Sub-Saharan Africa. So then it got to a point, most nations became highly indebted. So the World Bank and IMF, again, came up with another program known as the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. Who made them poor? How did they get poor? I'm not going to answer that, but you can. Yet, there is the need. Oh, it is the new perceived intelligence. We need to do something for the highly indebted poor countries. Oh, okay. How did that come about? Sure. But then, what about those who are not highly indebted poor? This is a question that I want everybody to ask. This initiative is just bypassing those who are not highly indebted. Though they could be indebted, but according to criteria, they're not highly indebted. They're not part of this program. So what are they going to continue to do? They're going to continue to do the structural adjustment program. One that has failed miserably. Okay. This was launched in 1996 by the group of 8 industrialized countries and the World Bank, IMF, and Regional Development Plans. It is a little different from at the time the Paris Club negotiations. And this one did not include what is known as the commercial loans. Were not part of it, but it is a really very simple program that this group of 8, IMF and the World Bank and the Regional Development Banks came together to say that what can we do for these highly indebted poor nations? And hence, we need to give them, do something to reduce their indebtedness. And hence, it became a program. Reducing debt is a program. But initially, this was followed for a long time before later it was enhanced. It later became a very good comprehensive program because it was enhanced to link debt relief to poverty reduction. Again, we missed the ball. We come back with poverty reduction. But the main reason why we were set up, IMF, World Bank, is to help the poor nations develop. And helping the poor nations develop is helping the poor within the poor nations to develop, not the rich. Okay? So, but these things always tend to come later. So after, I think in 1993 years after, they linked poverty reduction to that debt relief. And that brought what is known as, okay, I'll go into it later. What are the steps of the HIPC initiative? First, a country should be a low-income country, okay, and should face unsustainable debt situation. And then that country's debt level is considered to be unsustainable if debt to export level is above 150%, or if debt to government revenue is about 250%. Very high. So a country with 200% will not be considered as part of the HIPC initiative. The country should be only eligible for highly concessional assistance from IDA and IMF, and I will explain to you as concessional assistance. The assistance that these international financial institutions give to governments in developing world are two. We have concessional loans and normal loans. Okay, concessional loans are loans that have very low interest and very long repayment period. And these are given to countries that need it the most. So you should be a country who already is receiving concessional loans from the IMF, okay, and the World Bank. And that country should establish a track record of reforms and develop a poverty reduction strategy paper. See, when they link it to poverty reduction in 1999, then the PRSPs became very important. And if you go to the World Bank and type poverty, you see PRSPs. It became the order of the day. You need to present your poverty reduction strategy paper. And this poverty reduction strategy paper is simply a detailed countries plan to promote growth and reduce poverty through implementation of specific economic, social, and structural policies over a period of 3 years or longer. You should be able to show that track record before. And it also gives lenders the assurance that aid-receiving countries will use aid to pursue development outcomes that have been elaborated in the document. It's in order to reach a decision point. So we have starting point, decision point, and completion point. Starting point, you raise your hand and say, hey, I need it because I qualify. Look at my debt to GDP ratio and that kind of thing. I qualify. So in order to reach the decision point, okay, the decision point is the decision to give you all the loan, and completion point is when all the loans have been given to you. All the debt have been forgiven, okay? So the nation should have a track record of macroeconomic stability, must have prepared an interim poverty reduction strategy paper, and must have cleared any outstanding arrears. Okay, you shouldn't be having outstanding arrears. And at the decision point, the staff from the World Bank and the IMF determine the debt relief that the country may receive. The country then begins to receive interim relief on provisional basis. And then, to reach the completion point, so decision point and then completion. Completion is when they give you all the debt reliefs. The country must maintain macroeconomic stability under the PRGF support program and then implement the PRSP satisfactorily for 1 year. But the PRSP process, which is linked to what I'm going to propose very soon, must be a country-driven thing, not decided by the international financial institution, which is a little good, and should promote civil participation in terms of its formulation, implementation, and monitoring. It should be result-oriented, meaning focusing on outcomes that will benefit the poor. It should be comprehensive in scope, recognizing the multidimensionality nature of the causes of poverty. And then it should be partnership-oriented. What does that mean? Providing the basis for the active participation of development partners, who are they? IFIs, the rich nations. And then it should be based on medium and long-term perspectives. And at the completion point, the country received the full amount of debt relief, which now becomes irrevocable. Once we give you we tell you that you can't pay 2 billion of what you owe, you don't pay, it's irrevocable. You can come back and say that you have to pay because you didn't do well. So that's why the interim, you are supposed to do a lot of things before you qualify. And then, by August 2014, HIPCs were 39 countries, out of which 35 countries were at the completion point, 1 country at the decision point, and 3 countries at the pre-decision point. But let's look at the distribution. And the total funding at the time, in August 2014, was $76 billion. How was that commitment distributed in the developing world? Check. 86% of these are all African countries. Only 14% are in Latin America and Asia. So it is predominantly a sub-Saharan Africa approach. Okay. This is the total external debt at, I'm looking at how this thing works. Total debt at 2000 and then also 2013 expressed as a percentage of the country's gross national income. So the blue is the total debt at 2000 and the green is the current total debt, okay? And the red line separate countries that are in HIPC and countries in Africa that are not in HIPC, okay? So if you look at the countries that are in HIPC, they are overwhelmingly, you can see that their total debt as a percentage of GNI, right, reduced when they check into the system, okay? So because the current is green and the one at 2000 is blue. But then if you look at those who didn't check out, some of them, especially Seychelles, have too much debt as a percentage of GNI, okay? So to some extent, you see that there was a reduction of debt here as a percentage of GNI. Then, total external debt at 2000 and 2013. This is the total, not as a percentage of anything, okay? And this is also for 2000 and 2013. Again, the red line separates the HIPC countries from non-HIPC countries in sub-Saharan Africa. What do you see? The current total debt, especially let's go to my country, I like hitting on it so much. After we obtained this HIPC initiative and got debt reduction around 2000, a decade after, our debt has doubled. That's what it means. And then you can see from country to country, from country to country. There are some countries that did not go to HIPC but also did well, and surprisingly, Nigeria. Of course, they have a lot of oil, right? So if they manage the economy very well, they can pay off their debt without going through such system. Debt reduction should not be the focus of alleviating poverty in South Africa. This might not be a good program. Some of them haven't checked. Of course, they haven't checked it because they don't qualify with the percentage criteria, if you remember. Are you happy?
I'm happy. Yeah, that's good.
So what has happened? What's the outcome of the HIPC initiative? What's the outcome? It hasn't done that well. Very simple. Why? Because in most cases, state capacity to carry out the established strategy did not do well. But then the question is it because they don't have the capacity, or again, they still have the incentive not to make it well? Not necessarily not to make it well, but the incentive in how the money comes and what the money is used for. It's really very important. It hasn't changed. No new policy has changed the incentive. That is why my proposed strategy is going to change the incentive structure drastically. Okay? It will shift the burden of proof in the developing world. It hasn't. Donor influence, of course, it was initiated by the IFIs. Donors always will pinpoint and say, adjust this before I give you the money, or do that before I give you the money. So donor influence, and there is poor fulfillment of what is known as the participatory aspect. Of course, the government at the time, if IMF and the World Bank say that it should be participatory, they can just organize the party members to come and sit down and talk and you'll be seen. Sure, it's participatory, right? But what kind of participatory? Does it involve everybody? That's a question. So the participatory process has not been too good. And for that matter, like it's been criticized, that there's no clear definition of what civil participation means. Does it mean party members go sit down and then give a show to their program? Maybe. Okay. Even with the proposed PRSPs, poverty reduction strategy papers, some countries have difficulty following through with the intended policies and do not reach the intended outcome. This is mostly due to what? Misallocation of budgetary funds that were intended to go towards poverty reduction. And it has also increased aid conditionality. It hasn't changed the rules of the game. Aid conditionality, I will give you loan only when you do this, right? And even though it was supposedly created to undo the imposition of policy conditionality and promote country ownership, it hasn't created country ownership. The IFIs are still gatekeepers of development in the developing world. No significant difference in the objective of achieving sustained poverty reduction in the SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa. More HIPC outcomes. Notable novel feature. Yes, the PRSP has done something better than the rest, right? Poverty is defined in terms of multiple modes of deprivation instead of the unidimensional. I will explain later. Stress on income distribution and its role in the relation between income growth and poverty reduction in the program, so it's good. Long-term view on poverty reduction process, attainment of the Millennium Development Goals, roadmap for poverty reduction, it provides roadmap for poverty reduction, and then emphasize on the process, formulation, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And the nature of the external support, IMF support and the World Bank support have also changed. So there are some new things there. But then what are the old? It's still the old way of doing things. Why? Because again, initiated by the IFI. Development in Sub-Saharan Africa and most of the developing nations are discussed in Washington, D.C., not in those countries. Okay? No incentive for those people to really participate in the development or in bringing betterment to their own lives in their economies. require endorsement by the IFI. It hasn't changed. It's the same as the Stabilization and Structural Adjustment Program. It's the same as the Development Planning Programs. The macroeconomic framework for the PRSP is based on neoliberal market-determined prices, privatization, monetary and fiscal discipline. Nothing has changed. And conditionalities in terms of benchmark at various stages. Most of these benchmarks are the same as the ones in Structural Adjustment Program. Nothing has changed. It is just debt reduction and produce a paper that you would use the funds, otherwise that you would have used to pay us to reduce poverty. Oh, I can produce that. We have good economists. We can produce that. Whether we'll follow through is a different story. No proper incentive to shift from the old way of doing things. Total external debt at completion point of high HIPC countries in 2010. So, in 2000. The current total debt is you call this brown? Yeah, it's brown. And then the total debt at completion point is blue. So what do you see? You will see that in most nations, debt has increased after they got debt reduction. Okay? So after they got the debt reduction, that was debt, and now 2013 this is debt. When they got all the debt reduction, this is what they got. And now this one, they have all increased. So where are they going to? They are going to another debt crisis. There hasn't been any sustainable mechanism to make them shy away from piling up too much debt. So the overall assessment of all these regimes that we've gone through, let's see. First, we look at the poverty gap, which is a measure of poverty, in the 80s, 90s, 2000, and now. And what can we see? Poverty was only using poverty gap to measure poverty was 19.38%. It increased very significantly in the 90s. But then what do we have now? It's almost only 1.2% reduction over those decades. Not significant enough. What about poverty when we measure it with $1 a day? I don't think I can make this. Well, we can make it $1.25 a day or $2 a day. That also shows remarkable some increases, actually not reduction by the end. Okay, so either it's $1 a day or $2 a day. They have all increased now. So all these programs haven't significantly changed poverty situation in Sub-Saharan Africa, which they were supposed to. When it comes to income inequality, it has also worsened over time. And I will not go too much in detail, but you could see that these are what the IMF stabilization policies and the structural policies focus to reduce inflation, to reduce total debt, government expenditure should be reduced, and growth in money supply should reduce. But what do you see? Some of them are still really very high now than they were before. And this is what is sad about this presentation. In the 1960s, this is GDP per capita for Sub-Saharan Africa on the average, and these are for the Western countries, meaning Canada, US, Japan, and Western Europe. But what happened as we were promoting development in the developing world? The gap between the rich and the poor widened. Okay? And you can see this better if we look at this table. GDP per capita in those regions in Sub-Saharan Africa. So Japan, Sub-Saharan, US, Western Europe, and Canada. These are the GDP per capita over time, over those decades. And if you look at the second set, the ratios, it tells you how much richer these regions are compared to Sub-Saharan Africa. What's happened? They have all increased and increased further. And some improvement, but compared to the initial, still worse. So what has all these development programs done? They haven't been able to promote any significant development or catch up of the poor countries to the rich countries over time. And so 5 more increase. So I propose a different approach, and that different approach is known as comprehensive participatory rural development. Participatory rural development is not a new idea. It's not my idea. It has existed over time, but it has not been given the importance or the strength that it has in promoting poverty reduction in the developing world. So why rural development? Rural development is the way forward because it will enhance the capacity and well-being of the poor and make them greater net contributors to their economics and society. It will also give them the incentive, the voice, hope, and power to the poor to participate in national development, and this is normally known as the self-help approach. And then it is also known that it was used in Western Europe, Japan, Canada, and US to promote rural industrialization in the textile industry and the extractive and wood industry. Also, peasants and local organizations played important role in modernizing agriculture and raising standard of living of the rural people prior to and after Industrial Revolution. For example, in the 19th century saw the emergence of organizations among peasant farmers, mostly cooperative credit marketing, purchase and commercial input, insurance and education, who worked with the national government for policy purposes and national development. It also addressed the problem of the rural and the development directly without waiting for the benefit of urban industrialization to trickle down to the rural people. Direct. And the approach is not new. I'm not going to go through this. I'm just trying to show that it's not my original idea. Okay? It's not new. It has gone on for some time. At least even the PRSP recognized the importance of that. So in my case, I say PRSP has come closer to what we need to do, but it has to be tweaked. It has to be done very well. Is it truly participatory? No. Is it originated from the poor, from the local places? No. It's originated from IFIs. And the agents are the government, bypassing the people that it is designed for. They should be involved in the design and implementation of those things. And it is very important. Why? Because the World Bank itself has hinted on how important that is through 4 important documents. Rural Development in 1975, Rural Development Strategies from Vision to Action, of course. We've been visioning it, let's put it into action. In 1997, Reaching the Rural Poor, a renewed strategy for rural development, 2003. And most recently, the World Development Report, Agriculture for Development. These are all hinting that this might be the right way, but the rule of the game hasn't changed, but the ideas have changed. What are the features of successful rural participatory development? Greater involvement of the rural poor people in terms of ideas, energy, and determination of the self-help strategies. They will participate in activities that affect their economic productivity and quality of life, influence public decision, and manage their own affairs, the bottom-up approach. Effective involvement of local organizations, which are local government, farmers associations, cooperative, women associations, and youth associations, in the planning, adoption, managing, financing, and evaluation and monitoring of development projects. Exceptional leadership roles by local people, local leaders, effective role of NGOs, effective involvement of international development agencies. This time, the proposed here, no conditionality. These things might be developed by the people and could be financed by these international institutions. Okay? And there are many examples, some 2 examples I will give you. Integration into the overall national development agenda to increase the return of national investment in the rural areas in terms of road, electricity, health, education, large irrigation project, and research and development. This will come from the bottom up. Top bottom. Yes, I'm not saying the rural people should do this, but the rural people too should have their own development project in the rural areas, which will be integrated into the national development program. And it's always the most important. It always calls for appropriate technology, what the people understand and what they can do, not what can be imported. because it has failures. Appropriate technology is very important. And appropriate incentive structure. If the rural people are given the power to come out with their own program, discuss it, implement it, monitor it, they will do it. And examples show that they will do it even better than the national government has done for them and the IFS have done for them. And if I have a chance, I will go through at least one of them. Some instructive example from South Africa, please. Only one of them. There are two, but I'll go through one. The self-help rural water supply program in Malawi. Now, this example that I'm giving you has happened in all the developing world. I would take only one or two in Sub-Saharan Africa because we have a lot in Latin America. The Orange project in Latin America, the tree planting in Haiti, that reduced a lot of poverty, involved the poor people themselves, and the SANSA, the credit union initiative in Sri Lanka, the Orange project in Karachi, that led to infrastructure development by the people. They are not going to wait for government to come and construct sanitary schemes for them. They did it themselves because government was not doing it, right? So we have a lot around the world, but I'll focus on the ones in South Africa. The first one is the self-help rural water supply program in Malawi. Because Malawi at the time before this, and this is in the 60s. This is in the 60s. This is not a new thing. This was in the 60s. And it has ended up to become one of the best self-help projects in the world. Some say only in Africa, but it is in the world if you look around. It is simply a local communities just decided that the water supply problem was too much and government was not getting to them, so they had to do something by themselves. So these things were constructed by local people. The design, construction, supply of labor, and monitoring. There was a lot of course, voluntary. The engineer on the project, the person who started that project, was somebody who was working in the Ministry of Community Development and Social Welfare, but he decided government was not doing this thing for these people. He decided to get involved with local people to do this for themselves. So voluntary contribution is a very good criteria, eligibility for inclusion. Technical support and construction materials were provided by the government. The system and the government bought into it because it was a good project going on. And donor agencies bought into it because it was a good program. So it is what? Either by identification or by invitation, but not by imposition. Okay? So the water passes through, it's really very simple. The system brings pipe water to villages from a year-long sources, either from a spring or stream located in the mountains. So it's called the gravity-fed water supply, okay? So the water passes through some screens and sedimentation tanks that allow suspended particles to be removed before feeding thousands of communal taps and private connections. There's so many villages and towns that get their water supply in Malawi through this self-help project, not government. And they use what is known as appropriate technology that is understandable to the people, encouraging mass participation. And financing, like I said, later came from Danida, CEDA, also from Canada. Canada is there. UNICEF, the Dutch Christian organization, and later USAID. They all joined later. They didn't detect this project. They all joined later because it was a good project and was doing well. And this was after the success of a few projects. They joined after the success of people. The poor can do something for themselves. Give them the incentive, the right incentive, and they will respond. And since 1968, the gravity-fed system has been providing safe and reliable water to about 40% of the Malawian population. And due to its success, the Ministry of Community Development and Social Welfare created what is known as Rural Water Section within the ministry. The poor created this ministry. Okay? Very simple. It is one of the best rural pipe water projects in Africa, and the initiative was later extended to other projects in the rural area: health, education, sanitation. It has the potential. Then the second project is the 6X, building upon traditional social organization in Francophone West Africa. This is a project that involves a lot of countries in West Africa. And these countries are in the Sahel region, which is the most dry region, one of the most dry regions in Western Africa. And in most cases, when it is dry, there is no farming activity. They have to wait for the wet season before. So that will become a very elongated unemployment period for these farmers who normally don't have anything to do. So the 6X, a very small initiative, later became a multinational organization for rural development in the Sahel region of West Africa. And the 6X in English and in French simply means Se servir de la saison sec en savane et au Sahel. And hence the acronym 6X. 6X is in that name, in the French name. And this encompasses Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Niger, Togo, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. The initiative came about as a result of the severe drought in 1973. And Bernard Darku, regional inspector of the rural school, and his friend Bernard Lecombe, a Swiss national who was working in the ministries at the time, had lost faith, once again, in the government-sponsored development project. And hence they decided that they are going to set up something to help the village people to solve some of the challenges that they face during the dry season. And hence they created the 6Xs. The 6Xs provide support, financial support, for self-help efforts of voluntary village groups. And these village groups are grouped into what is known as zone or union. And then the zones are also grouped into what is known as federation or region. So it is like a federal system, okay? And this involved about 1,500 villages. And when they form these groups, each group must have elected official within the village people, meaning management committee, the chairman, secretary, and treasurer. And then technical specialists are hired on a temporary basis by the 6X, paid by the 6X, to help them solve the problem, to help them embark on those projects. And the main objective of the 6X was to support the village groups' effort to capitalize on the potential for undertaking development work during the area's long dry season, which otherwise the resources, the human resources, will go waste, or some of them will migrate to nearby towns to find meager jobs. They intended to harness these human resources in the regions, which otherwise, I said, migrate to towns in search of meager earning jobs to combat poverty. The human resources are used to build dams, so these are the projects. They are used to build dams, wells, and dikes, to plant vegetable gardens and trees, and to construct roads and schools, and to establish savings as well as grain bank. So it's not only a very simple project, multiple projects were undertaken by these village groups. And also literacy and health became important component of the development package. And then the 6X will provide mobile training mobile training schools to these villages. So there's a group of people who move from village to village within these 7 countries or so, move from village to village to give them some kind of technical knowledge that they lack. And these staffs are selected by the village people, not imposed on them. They are selected by the village people who work to facilitate rather than to supervise the project. Okay, so this is giving much more power to the village people themselves than for somebody. That is why they were given the opportunity to select these trainers themselves. And before a village receives a grant, which this is a very novel feature of this project, before a village receives a grant, it must have proven its determination to achieve local development by completing a project on its own. So the village will have to show that they know and they could organize themselves to do what they have to do to at least get out of poverty. Hence, once you complete this pilot project, you qualify to receive a grant to do other projects. And the CSA gives loans, and these loans were big, between 1 million to 2 million per year to a federation. That's the highest aggregation. And then the federation will divide the money, will share the money to the unions, and the unions will share the money to the village groups. And funds received are in combination of grants and loans. The grants are used for their operation cost, the loans are repayable. So the grants are not repayable, but the loans are repayable. And 3 years into the operation, the project served 3,000 groups located in 1,500 villages across the 7 countries. So only 3 years, it became a very big project across those 7 countries. So what are the key to success of these projects? And hence should become features of the comprehensive rural development that we are proposing here. First, involvement of the local organizations who derive their support from the people, the chief, and party leaders, and not from the national government. 2, low cost of operation and maintenance due to voluntary spirit. 3, popular participation in large community development projects. All the projects garnered popular participation. 4, developing local ownership in the process of planning, implementation, and monitoring. And hence, here I say, these are the right incentives that the people need to have before they will be able to solve their problems. 5th, timely scaling up and extending to other important community activities in the village project. Okay, so the initial programs are there, the initial project is there, but they always find themselves extending to other important projects in the communities. And then sharing responsibility between the local community and national government. Eventually, all these projects, national government comes into it. And when national government comes into it, national government's role is clearly stated, and then the community role is clearly stated, sharing responsibilities. Policies and ways of doing things did not come from top to bottom, but by day-to-day solutions to problems. So policies and procedure evolved, learning by doing, evolved, and not a big document that came from the ministries to the people in the village as to the pathway for undertaking those projects. And then the funding system was flexible. The funding system was flexible, a combination of grants and loans. And donor agencies, very important. Donor agencies joined the program instead of interfering with the design and implementation, and did not impose any conditionality. Conclusion. Earlier approaches to development in Sub-Saharan Africa have not significantly improved development in the region because of their incentive structure. The incentive structures are such that, as I said earlier on, for the recipient government, that it gives them more latitude for corruption. For the granting institutions, it makes them look like they are executing their duties, and they have to engage. Once they engage in the country, it becomes very difficult to drop that country, even if they are not performing. So disbursements must go, and the more the disbursement goes, corruption continues. So the incentive structure of those earlier projects failed, not only because some of the inherent policies were flawed, but also the incentive structures were not good. The present poverty reduction strategy papers, which is a component of the Enhanced Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative, is a very good start to the appropriate approach, but must be reconfigured to include the views, voices, and energy of those it is designed for, and must also come from bottom up, not up to bottom. Because first, they are recommended by the international financial institutions and donor countries. Second, prepared by government, supposedly with civil participation, which we have seen that because of the incentive structure, they would rather gather a few political party members who will be seen as being civil society to participate in the program only because that is what is needed for the international financial institutions to disburse the funds or to grant them the debt reduction. So hence, it's not really performing the intended duty to be truly participatory and involve civil society. The proposed approach should be a comprehensive national development strategy that includes the following elements. I am not here doing without the top-down approach in development. Every nation needs a national government to plan for the whole nation. So for sure, the top-down national urban development plan that includes the enhancement of institutions and creation of some macroeconomic environment must be part of this new way forward. But however, most importantly, a bottom-up participating integrated rural development strategy driven by the people in the rural areas must be part of this new era. Because so far it has not been given the right chance, or so far it has not played the role that it can play in development programs in these developing countries. Third, a national infrastructure development that incorporates the basic requirement of the two pillars of economic development, the first two that I've discussed, must be there. And then finally, foreign aid should not be a way of life, because for now, for most sub-Saharan African countries, it has become the way of life. The only way we can develop will be if we get a lot of foreign aid from the developing country, from the developed countries and the international financial institutions. Hence, it has become like a way of life. They have become highly dependent on that. Without that, we can't develop. I don't think that should continue to be the case. We should be able to develop. Of course, we need some assistance, but we should not be over-reliant on that assistance. Then these efforts must be supplemented by a comprehensive rural economy and poverty mapping, and this should be the basic component of the poverty reduction strategy. And what do I mean by comprehensive poverty mapping? It's very simply, most of these countries don't have very good data. Okay? And all the projects that we talked about earlier, the two examples that we talked about, are projects that the people themselves were able to give information on what is critically needed or what is lacking in the rural areas. So we could do this kind of comprehensive mapping. And this is why sometimes I tell my colleagues, if economists have failed poor nations and can't do these very basic things to help them, then they should step aside for the sociologists and the political economists. Because I know for sure they will be able to do this mapping very well. And because we tend, as economists, we tend to be overdriven by our concern for prices being right, instead of going down to the level of the people who critically need the development to really ascertain the critical information that they have that will become a very important component in the development strategy, in the new development strategy. And hence, I am sure my colleagues in the sociology department can do a better job there. Otherwise, we should do a better job going forward. Then the various economic development plans contained in the new strategy and their implementation should not be a conditionality, either by content or process, to any external funder. It should be owned by the people, and any economic sense of financing must be derived from the project, but should not be the driver of the project. Thank you.